Welcome to UGC E-Pathshala. I am Shamshad Ahmad Khan, visiting faculty, Department of East Asian Studies, Delhi University. Model 23. Today we will discuss Japan's rise as world power. The main objective of this module is to introduce you the changes that occurred in Japan immediately after Meiji Restoration. Japan decided to make it strong both militarily and economically following Meiji Restoration. Initially, this policy was to preserve its status as an independent country from the threat of external powers and their aggressions. But with the passage of time, Japan adopted policy of expansion similar to that of other imperialist powers such as Great Britain, Russia, Germany, and France. This module will also assist you in learning Japan's military and diplomatic strategies that helped Japan establish as a major power in Asia. But before that, let me give you a brief background. You are aware that Japan in 1633 adopted a policy of seclusion from the outside world. This policy continued up to 1868, and during this period, Japan had little interaction with the outside world. Japan had opened only few ports through which the East Asian nation has been interacting commercially with the outside world. During this period, various powers including Russia and the US made efforts to persuade Japan to open up more ports for commerce and trade with outside world. During this process, American naval commander William Perry succeeded in penetrating Japan in 1853 with his naval ships, which is also known in Japan as black ships. He bargained with the shogunate, the ruling authority of then Japan, to conclude a treaty of friendship and commerce with the United States. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom, following the Opium War with China, had already gained firm foothold in China in 1842 and took possession of Hong Kong. Meanwhile, the United Kingdom, following the Opium War with China, had already gained firm foothold in China in 1842 and took possession of Hong Kong. A speculation was rife that it will also try to expand in its influence within the region. Since Perry has assured Japan that the United States harbors no territorial ambition towards Japan, the shogunate thought that it would be prudent to conclude a treaty of friendship and commerce with the US, and a treaty known as Treaty of Kanagawa was signed in 1854 between the two countries. Japan agreed to open up two more ports of Shimoga and Hakodate. Japan agreed to provide fuel and fresh waters to visiting marines according to the agreement. It was also agreed under the most favored nation clause that any additional right granted by Japan to another power shall also be conferred to the United States. In the next attempt, the US succeeded in bargaining with Japan to open up few more ports under the Treaty of Anse. The treaty, signed in 1858, allowed the US to access ports of Kanagawa, Nagasaki, Niigata, and Hyogo for commerce and trade. Following this treaty, Russia, Great Britain, and Holland and France demanded similar treatment with Japan. Japan signed the similar treaties with these powers in quick successions. However, the arrival of foreigners on Japanese territory was not accepted by Japanese domestic constituencies, as well as samurais loyal to Satsuma clan. The treaties signed with the foreign powers had given the foreign residents some extra territorial rights, and also these treaties were signed without imperial sanctions. There were incidents of attacks on foreigners. The outcry became more vociferous with the slogan, "Revere the emperor and expel the foreigners." This led to law and order problem within Japan, and the demand to restore the power to the emperor was raised. Tokugawa Yoshinobu, the 15th shogunate, realized that it is no more possible to effectively govern the country, and he handed over the civil and military power to Japanese imperial court. Emperor Meiji in 1868 proclaimed the termination of shogunate and restored imperial rule. It can be said that the arrival of ships of William Perry at the Japanese shore resulted in the opening of secluded door of Japan. Now, interestingly, Meiji Restoration started with a slogan to create a rich nation and a strong military. Obviously, by aiming to make Japan militarily strong, Japan wanted to avoid any further humiliation by external powers. However, the idea was not to dominate the region by a strong military, but as time passed by, the Japanese ruling elites and the oligarchs pushed Japan to an ambitious expansionist path. Barely 30 years after the Meiji Restoration, a war between Japan and China broke out over the issue of Korea, Ryukyu Island and Formosa. It may be mentioned here that Japan had friendly relations with Korea when it was an independent state and served as a buffer state between Japan and China. But gradually, China gained its influence on Korea and it became a vassal state of China. A rising Japan wanted to restore the independent status of Korea on the pretext of quelling civilian unrest that broke out in Korea in May 1894. Japan dispatched its troops to Korea. China did not approve this step by Japan, and the hostilities between the two on the issue of Korea resulted into a Sino-Japanese War in July 1894. The external powers expected that it would be China who would emerge victor in the war. However, against their expectations, Japan triumphed in the war over China. A truce was announced between the two warring states, and in 1895, the two parties signed a treaty called Treaty of Shimonoseki in the port city of Shimonoseki, closer to present South Korea. As part of the Treaty of Shimonoseki, a truce was announced between Japan and China after Japan's victory in the First Sino-Japanese War. As agreed in the treaty, China recognized the full and complete independence of Korea. China also ceded to Japan Liutang Peninsula, Formosa and Pescadores. Moreover, China opened up a specific section of the Yangtze River to Japanese commerce and the ports of Shashi, Shocho, Chungking, Hangzhou to Japanese trade. China also granted Japanese subjects in Japan the most favored nation's privileges. With the surprise victory over China in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894, Japan established itself as a rising power in the East Asian region. However, the external powers, especially Russia, France and Germany, who had deep economic and territorial interest in the region, demanded revision of the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Because of the outside intervention, also known as triple intervention, Japan succumbed to pressure and restored Liutang Peninsula to China by ratifying the Treaty of Shimonoseki. Despite the restoration of Liutang Peninsula, Japan gained a toehold in the mainland China and also fulfilled its long-held ambition to restore the independence of Korea. The outcome of the war had tremendous impact on the thinking of other powers such as Great Britain. Britain considered Japan a potential ally to counter Russia's expansionist aspiration in the region, and it later concluded First Sino-Japanese Alliance in 1902. As part of this agreement, Japan and Great Britain agreed to uphold the independence and territorial integrity of the Empire of China and the Empire of Korea, and to secure equal opportunity in those countries for the commerce and industry of all nations. More importantly, Japan and Great Britain agreed that in case either Britain or Japan get involved in a war with another power to safeguard its interests with a third power, both will maintain a strict neutrality and use its efforts to prevent other powers from joining in the hostilities against its ally. But in case any other power enters the war, the other will come to assistance and will conduct war in common. From the point of view of the Japanese interest, this provision of the treaty was much more important, and it gave confidence to Japan, which was an emerging power in the region. As it was stated previously, Japan was wading through the East Asian waters to place itself among the great nations following the Meiji Restoration. It realized that Russia could be a potential challenger to Japan, which had similar interests in the region. It has been successful to pressurize Japan with the help of Germany and France to restore Liaotang Peninsula to China. A section within the Japanese oligarchy at that time was of the view that Japan should reach some understanding with Russia to safeguard its interest. Therefore, Japan proposed an exchange policy to Russia, asking Russia to recognize Japan's sphere of influence in Korea, and in return, Japan will recognize Russia's sphere of influence in Manchuria. Russia was very clever and it welcomed Japan's proposal to renounce its interest in Manchuria, but on its part, it did not give any firm commitment to recognize Japan's sphere of influence in Korea. Later, Russia expanded its influence in Liaotang Peninsula, from which Japan was forced to withdraw by triple intervention, and finally occupied entire Manchuria in 1900, taking advantage of Boxer uprising in China. Japan once again mooted the exchange policy and wanted a negotiation with Russia on the issue of Manchuria. However, Russia did not show any interest in engaging Japan in any negotiations. Japan finally declared war on Russia in February 1904. Japan did not expect that Great Britain, with whom it had signed a treaty of alliance 2 years back, will come to any assistance. However, Britain provided financial assistance to Japan to meet some cost of war. Japanese naval and land forces not only offered formidable assistance but emerged triumphant in the war. A peace treaty was brokered between Japan and Russia by the US, and the two warring parties announced cessation of hostilities by signing Treaty of Portsmouth in September 1905. The salient point of this treaty was the Treaty of Portsmouth recognized Japan's political and economic interests in Korea. Japan also inherited Chinese territory of Kwantung, where Port Arthur and Dalian is situated from Russia. Russia accepted Japan's demand to allow it to operate railway in South Manchuria. Japan also acquired southern half of Sakhalin, a Russian territory closer to present Hokkaido. Now, Japan's victory over China and Russia in quick successions helped itself establish among the world powers. By the two successive victories over China and Russia, it established its interest in Korea and southern Manchuria. These victories also helped Japan to bargain with Britain from the position of strength to extend the Anglo-Japanese alliance tenure, which was to expire in 1907. Both the parties abandoned the neutrality clause they had in the first Sino-Japanese alliance of 1902. It may be noted that the Great Britain feared that the expansionist Russia may try to gain its influence in India, which was administered by the British at that time. Japan and Great Britain, in their agreement, agreed that in case Russia attacked India, Japan would come to the assistance of its ally and conduct the war in common, and in case Russia invaded Manchuria, part of which had come under Japanese administration following the Treaty of Portsmouth, Britain will rush to help Japan and jointly conduct the war. The situation, however, did not arise to implement these provisions of the treaty. Neither Russia attacked India, nor did the possibility of war arose between Japan and Russia over Manchuria. In fact, Japan skillfully negotiated with Russia in separate bilateral negotiations not to harm each other's interests in China. Japan accepted Russia's sphere of influence in Outer Mongolia in return. After making the regional and external powers agree to accept Japan's interest in Korea, Japan made successive efforts to gain a direct control over Korean Peninsula. It may be mentioned that when Japan was involved in a war with Russia, it had started a negotiation with Korea. In February 1904, a protocol was signed between Japanese and Korean government which allowed Japan to take some special administrative and military measures to safeguard Korea's territorial integrity in the event of an external aggression as well as an internal disturbance. Korean government also agreed to engage a Japanese subject as financial advisor to the Korean government. In the next step towards further strengthening its control over Korea, Japan signed second protocol with Korean government in 1905. The protocol allowed Japan to appoint a Japanese Resident General in Korea. The Japanese Resident General directed the foreign policy matters of the Korean government. By signing this protocol, Korea virtually became a protectorate of Japan. After gaining control on Korea's external affairs, Japan tried to gain control of internal administrative matters as well. Japan signed Third Japanese-Korean Agreement in June 1907. This agreement allowed Japanese Resident General to take control of all administrative matters such as appointment of and dismissal of the officers as well as enactment of all laws and ordinances within Korea. By two successive agreements, Japan took control of all internal as well as external matters of Korean administration. In the next step, Japan annexed Korea in 1910, which has also been discussed in a previous UGC module. Meantime, Japan and Great Britain signed a third Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1910. After the annexation of Korea, Japan and Great Britain signed a third Anglo-Japanese alliance in 1911. Since Japan has already gained influence in major parts of East Asia by that time, there was not much enthusiasm to extend the alliance further. But given the rising naval powers of Germany, Britain thought that Japan would be an important partner to deter Germany's military might. Japan, on its part, felt that the alliance with Britain will be indispensable to safeguard Tokyo's interest in the Far East. Against this context, a third Anglo-Japanese alliance was signed in July 1911, which was merely an extension of the previous alliances. This alliance remained effective till 1921, and thereafter both parties let it lapse. The changing security situation in Europe resulted in the breaking out of World War I. Now, the issue of World War I and Japan has already been discussed in a separate module, but here let me give you a recap. Since Japan had alliance with the Great Britain, British expected Japan to dismantle Germany in the Far East, to weaken it militarily, and also to distract its attention away from the European theatre. Seizing this opportunity to participate in the war, Japan contemplated driving out Germany from Xiangtao, which was part of China. Japan launched an attack on German-held bases in Chinese territory, especially Xiangtao and Kiaochao, and subsequently occupied their territory by November 2015. After this victory over Germany in the Far East, Japanese grew more ambitious and by May 1915 presented 21 demands to China, which annoyed Western powers including the United States, which argued that these demands contradict the principle of equal opportunity and an open door policy. Overall, it threatened China's sovereignty. China, however, acceded to some of these demands, including the extension of lease of some of the Chinese ports to Japan. When the World War I ended with the defeat of Germany, in accordance with the mandate of League of Nations, Japan gained jurisdiction of some of the islands in the Pacific Ocean previously held by Germany. This helped Japan extend its territory further. More importantly, Japan gained membership of the League of Nations and thus established itself as a world power at par with the Western nations. However, during the World War I, reactionary forces supported by Japanese military started wielding enough influence in politics and foreign policy of Japan. The ambitious policy of Japan, decided by military forces, led to the invasion of Manchuria in 1929, which was opposed by the West. The bickering between Japan and the West led it to the withdrawal of League of Nations. Thus, it led to the seclusion of Japan from the existing powers. On the other hand, influence of military cliché grew, pushing Japan into Pacific War. Ended in Japan's decimation by the other powers in the World War II, and Japan was forced to renounce its sovereignty over the empire it had built after its expansionist policy adopted after 1868. Thank you.